I am multiply disabled, multiply
Mm,
queer,
mm,
non-binary, and a multidisciplinary artist from rural
mm.
Canada. So,
Ooh.
yeah, I am a community scientist, policy writer, intersectional disability justice advocate, and I'm also the community organizer for TEA, which is a
Oh.
nonprofit, volunteer-maintained DAO LLC marketplace that's on Tezos. My most prominent mediums currently are photography, vocals, and poetry,
Oh,
because
wow.
those are the most accessible to me currently, with
Mm,
my variety of conditions and symptoms. um, but I have pretty much worked in every single medium you could imagine, from painting to
mm,
assemblage to metalwork to textiles and
mm,
many, many more.
mm,
um, I'm part of the KIND community,
mm,
which is short for chronically ill, immunocompromised, neurodivergent, and disabled. And I am
mm,
all of those things.
mm,
So a lot of intersections even within my own uh, disability identity.
right.
I create in near complete isolation. Quarantine is
Mm,
still very much on for me and will
mm-hmm,
be in perpetuity.
mm,
Um, and my artistic focus is mostly centered around themes of isolation, time, cycles in nature, sexuality, gender,
ooh,
sensory experiences, decay, and biomimetics. And all of
mm.
those are through the intersectional equity lens, as well as exploring the connections between art and STEM.
When I saw your work, it was so calming and peaceful and like very reminiscent of these still lives that we're very familiar with in art history. And I was very intrigued, like, to say the least, that this was one of the submissions that was sent in. These are the types of like works and visuals that I think spark conversations about other ways to embody queerness and other ways to be present with it, in terms of how you're kind of like relating to your body and how you're bringing in these other experiences from your other disciplines into your practice. So can you tell me a little bit about this piece?
The piece Aubergine in Repose, I sought to explore a depersonification,
Mm,
um, and while using sexually linked mimetic imagery
mm-hmm,
within the bounds of classical painting techniques and forms. And
mm-hmm.
like as a multiply queer, non-binary, and disabled person, erasure and objectification is a common occurrence within cultural spaces that I occupy.
Yes.
Um, and then there's also the want for the resistance to that as well,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, it is, of course, a photograph, but my effort
mm,
was centered around creating the lighting and staging conditions that would emulate the mood and visual impression of a Renaissance style oil painting,
mm,
complete with like the positioning, the palette, the fabric textures. The aubergine itself, a phallic symbol of sex and masculine
mm,
energy, as placed on a tasseled cushion in a sensual and
mm,
voluptuous position, is a coy
mm,
replacement for the form usually occupying that space, which would be a nude white woman,
mm,
um, to counter the dominant Western male gaze while
mm,
exploring the objectification of the phallus in contrast and
mm,
exposing that phallus to the inherently understood framing of the male gaze while
mm,
creating the space for the female and trans gaze to be able to observe that work as well.
mm.
Um, and the anthropomorphic reduction of the individual to a phallic fruit
Mhm,
forces
yeah.
that objectification and thus like intentionally recreates visually the avoidant language used to describe sensuality, intimacy,
Mm,
and rest as well.
mm,
Like as a disabled person, like culturally we're not taught to rest or value rest. We're not taught
mm,
to consider ourselves as sexual objects or sexual
mm,
beings. um, Intimacy is limited in a caregiving capacity often, and little outside of that. So I wanted to explore like all of those little components.
mm,
um, but yeah, I can talk a little bit about my process too, because it does vary um,
mm.
a lot from what most most people do because of my many conditions and symptoms
Yeah,
which I have to
yeah.
manage.
Like, thank you so much for that context. It's so well, like, articulated and very clear in relation to the imagery and the composition that you're generating. The
Hmm.
lighting is spectacular. When I saw it, I mean, I had to stare at it. And I think it's kind of like that inviting contemplation that
Hmm.
you were trying to like mimic with this lighting of the painting. I was like, is this a painting? Is this photography? I was like, is this AI? Like, what is the context with this?
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
amazing. Like again, I was very excited by this piece. I think you did a fabulous job, and I can't wait to hear kind of like your process with this. But I also just
Mhm.
kind of wanted to touch on these aspects too of like I really enjoy the way that you're building this connection. I think that's always been very present of like queerness and nature. I think that nature is very queer and it is
Mhm.
very liminal, right? It occupies so many different spaces. And also sometimes
Mhm.
the way that we imbue nature with certain kind of like cultural ideas or representations,
Mhm.
or yeah, like different interpretations of what it can mean. I think it's also super interesting. And it reminded me a lot of how queerness throughout history and art history, for example, has always been very coded and
Yeah,
very kind of
exactly.
like
Yeah.
hidden, but also very present. And I think for me, that's something that's like kind of very, it's a lot of things, but it's very kind of comforting the ways that queerness can embody and represent so many different things. Because I think like contemporary, like when we think of queerness, we think of like loud, colorful, and like very like out there and present, which I think is like a very like more contemporary and modern form to embody that queerness, which obviously for a long time we weren't able to do. But I think like
Mhm.
coming back to these kind of like legacies of, coding queerness through nature or through art or, these different strategies, I think is also there's still so much to explore there. And I think that when I think of talking or like discussions of disability, how um it's still something that's kind of very hidden and kind of pushed
Mhm.
down in the types of conversations that happen, even though we all engage and relate to disability at different points in our lives, whether through like temporary disability or more long term. And I think that the pandemic really made us question and bring those things a little bit more to the forefront of the
Mhm.
types of conversations that disability activists have been engaging with for so long. But I
Mhm.
also like really enjoyed how you're using that and you're kind of like bringing in these dialogues of rest, which is so important. And I think that um, I think also that queerness has a very like kind of complicated relationship with as well, because rest is
Mhm.
political, it's necessary, but also sometimes I think queer bodies are not afforded that ability to rest because we're in constant kind of like upheaval
Mhm.
and kind of survival mode. And I think those moments of like rest and repose and contemplation and meditation are so important. Tell me a little bit about your process making this piece.
Yeah, sure. So, in my photography in general, I create primarily with a Nikon D3500 with a
Mm.
55 to 200 millimeter lens and a 68 millimeter extension tube so that I can get nice fine details
Mm.
in nature. I do uh, I do not edit my photographs and I do not use
Really?
artificial lighting or staging with the exception of rare instances in this piece, Aubergine and Repose, and its recent pairing, Bacchanal, which I recreated the
Mm.
same conditions to make a twin piece for this one about a
Oh.
year after I made the first one. So
Ooh.
not edited. These still aren't edited, but those two photographs are staged and artificially lit. Everything else
Mm.
is created in situ
Mm.
within my permaculture organic gardens.
Mm.
I've been documenting every living thing that I can there, identifying each to learn about what shares my space and how each
Mm.
interacts within the ecosystem. So things like animals, plants, insects, fungi.
Mm.
Um, my refusal for post production and staging is very intentional.
Mm,
Like I am well versed in Photoshop and similar tools, but with my
mm,
photography, my intention is to capture the raw moment, blemishes and
mm.
all.
Yeah.
As a queer, non-binary disabled person, self-editing, forced editing, and erasure is encouraged and enforced
Yeah.
within our society. So with my photography, the photographs represent my body as a self-portrait in time of
Mm,
pain that I'm experiencing, as represented by textures and forms or sensual exploration, internal dialogues that I may be exploring on a myriad of topics in my mind as I'm creating. Um, in my photographic self portraits, I don't want to self edit, but instead create moments um, in nature that are unseen and unvalued for their
mm,
inherent nature to counter that socialized erasure and pursuit of perceived perfection.
mm,
Um, and much of my process is modified as well to meet my access needs.
mm,
As I mentioned before, many a symptom
mhm,
expression, many a condition to manage all at once. So I began to photograph in earnest about, I think it was about 6 years ago now, um, to rebuild my stamina and rebuild my muscles after a
mm,
still unknown condition
mm.
caused me to rapidly waste several years ago,
Oh.
to the point where I was very much unable to take care of myself, unable
Mm,
to lift my limbs and things like that.
mm,
Um, so each day, as like an exercise, I would explore my gardens for as long as I could tolerate, and then I would sit down on the ground for 15 minutes, and then I would make my way back inside and allow my body to rest while exercising my mind. And I would research everything
mm,
that I had photographed that day. Um, and then another symptoms of my many conditions is my hand tremors,
mm,
which while I'm photographing, I counter in a syncopated motion,
mm,
attempting to create the photo in the brief moment where focus and clarity exist in the frame.
mm.
Um, and so it's taken a lot of practice to get that down.
Yeah.
But my friend and fellow photographer Joshua K. Flynn asked me about this process and asked if I had ever used the tremors intentionally as part of my process,
Mm, mhm.
which immediately I went outside in the middle of winter, late at night, to photograph the moon while letting my tremors run free, which led to my
Ooh.
Moon Tremors series, which has each piece has its own accompanying poem as well, 20-piece
Mm.
series. Um, but yeah, I'm excited to explore that portion of my creative process a bit more and unpack some of the internalized ableism, obviously,
Yes.
that led me to
Yes.
unconsciously attempt to hide my tremors in my
Oh,
practice.
yes.
Um, but yeah, it's all very fun and a little bit different than what I think most people would need to do for the creative process,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I make it work for me.
I love people are coming to terms like with their queerness, and with the different with the engaging like in different ways with their body. I think
Yeah,
and
grieving
almost this
process.
grieving, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Disdain
yeah.
sometimes for the ways that our bodies act in a way that is not convenient for the type of like, heteronormative, like capitalist society that we live in. But I
Mhm,
think it's always so powerful when we are able to engage and have that space of like companionship and compassion for our bodies to kind of like find new ways to engage with them and explore and kind of like redefine what we value in the ways that our bodies are expressing ourselves. And I think that I really like this kind of connection that you're having with nature. Um,
mhm,
and you mentioning that you kind of just wanted to like document nature as it was. And I think that that's
mhm,
also such a beautiful metaphor, and such like a kind of like way to conceptually explore the self portrait, because again, like we are nature as well, and to kind of like accept ourselves in the ways that our
mhm,
bodies are reacting is so, it goes back to this idea of like radical acceptance, which is a
mhm,
cyclical process that is very challenging but also very kind of like transmutational. And I really, I really kind of like appreciate, hearing you come in exploration with that and that possibility, and also kind of like knowing that it's always like never ending, like these realizations that, even, sometimes we're in our head and we have all these concepts about, who we are and what we can be, and the type of worlds that we want to make. But it's like these aha moments where other people say like, oh well, have you considered, trying this. It's so almost kind of exciting because it reminds you that there's always so much possibility and so much more to explore. And it reminds me like,
Hmm.
in the same way that like, technology has glitches, like the way that, these tremors can be glitches and can be like a space for possibility, I think is so, it's so encouraging. And what are some projects that you're currently working on? How are you excited? Like what's kind of like calling your attention currently? What's in store?
Well, I do have a project list of over 120 items, which I
Yes.
do I do hope to work on when I have time between my, you know, organize the TEA organizing duties. Currently focused right now on music development and poetry to explore
Oh.
systems of oppression and equity justice. Um,
Mm.
and some painting series which will explore socially coded norms.
Oh.
Um, I will be attempting to learn code so that I can
Oh.
develop some immersive, experiential digital spaces to highlight disability related and sensory experiences. And I want that to be
Oh.
able to be an educational tool as well
Mm.
as an opportunity to provide acknowledgement to those experiences, either
Mm.
from people who do experience them or for people who have never experienced them. And it helps to shift their thinking to better support disabled folks.
Mm.
I will be exploring uh, more into the avoidant coded languages and mimetic symbology of queer and disabled culture
Ooh.
in different pockets of the world to better understand myself as a person who
Mm.
experiences both of those things combined and simultaneously exists in the space between both of those,
Mm. Mhm.
that liminal space,
Mm.
as well as to add to the cultural lexicon in my own way. Um, yeah, I really think that it's critical to explore and express my identities through art
Yeah.
as a means of decompression for trauma, but
Mm.
also
Mhm.
as a communication tool,
Mm.
um, and as a means to combat erasure, of course.
Yeah.
Um, I, queer culture has been intrinsically tied to art through that symbology and the direction narrative challenges and exploratory processes. And I
Mhm.
kind of want to keep adding to that in my own way.
Yeah.
Um, because it does serve as a cultural bridge through time,
Yes.
queer art
Yes.
specifically, right?
Yes.
So even into other cultural spaces related to like gender or race or location, health, and many more. So as a communication tool, it I want to explore what both shocks and soothes,
Mm.
because I feel like it's a necessary component to collective liberation as well
Yes.
as my own personal exploration. So there obviously have been portions of our cultural history that have been intentionally erased, but there's
Mhm.
that through line that persists regardless,
Yeah.
because queer expression is so dynamic and adaptable depending on
Yeah.
the conditions of the time that it is existing in,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Yeah. So I think it's necessary to shed light on the in between.
Yes. The in
Um,
between. My favorite
yeah,
space, the in between. The most
yeah,
complicated but rewarding space.
exactly. Yeah, where those connections form. I love that space.
Yeah.
It's exactly where I want to be.
I love that.
Yeah, and so lots to work on.
Yes, that's
But
exciting.
yeah, I feel really good about it. So
Mm.
I'm really looking forward to it,
That's
especially the
really,
music stuff, because like
yeah,
this
that's
this is
awesome.
new for me. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
a new ways to challenge.
Yeah, I've always sang and I've always done mimicry and all of that stuff, but
Mm.
I'm trying to like put that into a form that will make sense, but
Yeah.
still exploring it in a way that doesn't have bounds. and I will
Mm.
be releasing it all on blockchain. So,
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. Yes, I'm definitely a fan of expanding and exploring all of these things in blockchain. I think there's always so many issues with it, but I think that that's like again a space for questioning and for possibility. And I think
mhm,
my thing always like when people are so like resistant and hesitant to talk about blockchain or NFTs is I think that I always tell them I'm like for me, being Latinx, being queer, being femme, like I do recognize, obviously, the problems with accessibility that this could have for the majority. But if I
mhm,
have the ability and the time and the energy to make space or just even be present in that space and witness in whatever capacity I have, I'm going to do it.
mhm,
Because
exactly. Yeah.
obviously like it's important to critique, but it's also important to be there and like know where you're critiquing from. So I think like a lot of the work that
Mhm,
I've some of the things that I've been doing too is like just trying to spark those conversations in Spanish, and develop like source material in Spanish that is relevant to the communities here and that will generate helpful dialogues here because I think that that's the most important thing. It's like we have to generate dialogue around these technologies because if not, of course, they're going to end up replicating the same things we're fighting against
exactly.
because it's a
Exactly.
question of accessibility. So I think
Yeah.
that um, I got into the space because a queer digital artist, Edgar Fabian Frias, who's a good friend of
Mhm,
mine, told
mhm,
me, they're like, hey, you need to like look into this. Like, we need to be making and talking within these spaces. And I think that that excited me a lot. So I think fortunately my experience within the NFT and the blockchain scene has been very positive, has been
mhm,
very amazing, particularly because I've been able to connect more with queer artists, digital artists, who are women, and I think for me that has been very rewarding. So obviously I understand that a lot of people have other experiences with it, but again, it's like the possibilities are there, and I think it's important for everyone to kind of like explore and see what they can do with it.
exactly. I
Yeah,
agree
that's
wholeheartedly.
exciting. Yeah, that's exciting. Of course you do. Of course you do. I love it.
Mhm.
All right, Mal, I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you
Me
so
as
much
well,
for
yeah.
your time. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
opening up, for your vulnerability. I'm really excited. Yeah, we'll be in touch. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right,
I
Mal, you
really
have a
enjoyed
lovely
myself.
day. Oh, I'm really
Yeah,
glad. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing more of your work and all of these wonderful new explorations you're thinking about.